I will try and entertain you with a few slides, so I'm not sure how much I'll succeed, but that's my attempt. As an aside, I cannot not start with a bit of a marketing pitch for Bain. So bear with me. We are really keen to double down and hire at the ISB. And this is my first time here, and I'm absolutely blown away by your campus. I went to a college in Philadelphia, and this is an excellent campus. And I will make it a point to make sure we come down here and we double down and make this one of our core schools. So we're looking forward to having many of you join us and help enable our growth. So I couldn't resist the pitch to all of you here. Also, as an aside, I've given a bunch of talks, as many of us have, but you've helped me create a little bit of equity with my kids. And whenever I tell them I'm going to go give a talk, it's just yawn and let's move on to the next topic. But my younger son, who's 13 years old, reaches out to me and says, "Dad, for the first time, I think you're on a cool panel, and I didn't realize that you're speaking with some really cool people." So he follows Malika Dua, and his only ask to me was, "Come back with a selfie of Malika Dua," which I of course will not have. But in the eyes of my kids, thanks to your invitation, I've gone up a little bit in terms of hanging out with cool people and hanging out with Ryan and others here as well. So let me start. This is a topic we feel very strongly about. We've done a ton of research, and I hope it resonates with you. And it's really about the concept of founder's mentality. So let me start by talking about 3 key messages that I'd love to share and leave with you today. The first one really is there is the basis of competitive differentiation and competitive advantage is dramatically changing. I think we all recognize what's happening externally. We've got a super abundance of capital globally. We've never seen this in the last 10 years in terms of the amount of assets, financial capital that is available. Second, I think we all recognize the technology disruptions that are taking place. But very interestingly, the speed and the accelerated nature of change is creating this huge question about how do we think about sustainable competitive differentiation. So that's the first thing that I'll talk about, and I'll share with you a little bit of data. The second one is actually fairly paradoxical. In a lot of our research, we find the issue is not the market. The issue is the internal functioning of organizations. And I'll share with you why we believe that is incredibly predictable and incredibly controllable. And that could be the means of how do you start to create competitive differentiation and strive for profitable, sustainable growth, which drives shareholder returns. And the third one is the research we've done is in today's dynamic, fast-changing world, we believe if you do not preserve and deepen the founder's mentality, you're missing a trick. So those are the 3 messages I'd love to leave you with in the next 20, 25 minutes. Let me share with you a little bit of data on the first. I'm going to take you through an example, and this is airlines globally. And I'm going to take you through to show you what is a dramatic change we're seeing industry after industry. And we've got the same chart, which is quite fascinating when it comes to consumer products, when it comes to tech, when it comes to oil and gas, when it comes to pharmaceuticals, when it comes to insurance, you name the industry. The change is dramatic. So this is really, if you look at 1999 and the market cap of the top 20-odd companies. And if you fast forward just 5-6 years, if you look at just watch where American Airlines is at 9.3 billion euros, the change is dramatic in a few years. This is 1995. This is 2005 relative to 99. You fast forward another few years post the global financial crisis, and you see the change in the industry structure in terms of changing positions, in terms of American Airlines no longer even being on this chart, and in terms of the rise of new players. So industry structure is dramatically changing. in a period of a few years. Now, a lot of people will look at this and say, what an opportunity. But it also raises the question, why? What's happening? And for legacy companies, what do they do to try and stay at the top of their game when you have such dramatic change in the market? Pretty amazing. Second, I think we all recognize the digital economy upon us. The data is incredibly stark. So this is really, I stole this from an Alibaba presentation, who, we do a bunch of work with Ali. And they were looking at 2007. And this is the largest, it's the league tables in 2007 globally. Pretty amazing, right? If you look at this, you will see one tech company. You will see 3 Chinese companies on the league tables globally. Fast forward 2017, 2018, it is dramatic. In the league tables, you've got now 7 tech-related companies. Of the 7 tech-related companies, the top 5 are more than 4 trillion. Just compare that to where you have the market caps at the bottom of the page. If you look at also the rise of China and the rise of the emerging markets, you're seeing 2 in 2017, 2018. And if you look at Mary Meeker's report, it's interesting when you look at the top 20 internet players globally in terms of valuation. You're seeing 11 from the US, 9 from China. And I hope India breaks into that league as well. So a dramatic change when it comes to value creation and from the digital tech companies. I'm sure we've all seen a chart like this before. This is the rate of speed and the adoption of new products. But it's mind-boggling to continue to stare at this kind of data. And even if you look at where Google Plus, in the time of a few months to get to 50 million users, just think about it, it's dramatic. So the speed of new product introduction and new product adoption is something unprecedented that we have not seen going forward. But it doesn't stop with new products. It's also the rise of new business models. I think we all recognize this, but it's worth just reading through the text here. Uber, as we all know, the world's largest taxi company, no vehicles, right? Facebook, no content. Alibaba today has a greater market cap than Walmart. It took Walmart 54 years, and Alibaba in 13 has greater market cap and is the biggest retailer in China and has global ambition, has no inventory, right? Airbnb, we're doing work with a bunch of similar aggregators, owns no real estate, incredibly capital light. And the same when you think about WhatsApp as well. So pretty dramatic changes in terms of business models that are rapidly being adopted and challenging legacy companies. What this means is, if you go back in the past 10, 20, 30 years, people always talked about the scale advantage. Scale advantage remains, but really, I think other factors are going to make a lot more difference as we think about going forward and we think about differentiation. The whole ability and the speed and the velocity to respond and to be proactive is something which is quite critical going forward. Second is, how do you create a learning organization? And how do you get access to talent like what we have in this room so that we are being able to get the best? This is what Ryan and I were just chatting about. How do you get the best? How do you keep the best and get them to help you reinvent and re-energize your business models when you're having this kind of change? We are working a lot with a lot of the digital unicorns, and this is globally, and this is in India, and this is in Southeast Asia as well. And our next big piece of research that we are already embarking on, based on the work we're doing with these large disruptive companies, is really helping them think about and capture the speed to scale. And if you look at the number of companies that are trying to get to $1 billion, $5 billion, and $10 billion, it's record breaking in terms of their speed to get to these metrics. And then if you look at if you talk to the legacy companies, 60% of the legacy companies today would say that their competitor is going to be a different competitor than who they are focusing on today. So again, a rise of different competitive models, and how do we think about the speed of scale? And it's super fascinating when we work with the likes of a Grab, or the likes of an Ali, or the largest unicorns in India who we are working with. I mean, there's a unicorn that I'm advising, and the founder and I, we are talking about how do we scale 3 to 5x in 1 year. 1 year. Just think about managing the complexity, managing the entire organization when you're scaling 3 to 5x in 1 year. They've just opened up a business in China. They will scale even faster in China. That speed to scale is a huge asset and a huge competence to think about going forward. This is the research we've done, which is pretty, and we've been doing this for the last 30, 40 years. For us, shareholder returns are driven by companies that create sustainable, profitable growth. So what do we mean by that? So over a 5 or 10 year or long period of time, which companies actually have out-delivered on the top line and the bottom line and returned back the cost of capital? If you do this math, as we have done globally, we've done in Asia, we've done in India, we get to the same conclusion. And the conclusion is there's roughly about 1 in 10 chance of any company being a sustained value creator. It's really hard. It's really hard to sustainably and profitably grow ahead of your competitors, and earn back your cost of capital. So this is a lot of the bedrock of what we base our strategy on, and really deeply understanding what makes these companies successful. But what was also equally revealing is we went back and said, for those 9/10 of the companies that did not make it, what were the real issues? And the research has been quite eye-popping. And what we basically found is that the barrier to growth is not the marketplace. In spite of all the change that's taking place, there is tremendous opportunities for us to grow. The challenge is really all internal. And as we look at this chart here, 23% saying we don't have the right capabilities. 24% saying, our business plans were pretty suboptimal. 45% insufficient misallocation of resources. Culture, the operating model of a company, quite critical. Huge source of competitive advantage. Inability to focus. I've taken on too many opportunities to try and scale. And tremendous organizational complexity. So quite stark, huh? The issue is really internal. While we're looking, and most of us are focusing and saying, wow, look at the change that's happening externally. So it's not because of a lack of opportunity that we're seeing people hold back. So if you go a step later, a lot of the research that we've done is really saying we have metrics today that do a wonderful job and are very scientific when it comes to how we are performing, when it comes to the external market. We look at loyalty metrics to look at customer advocacy. We look at TSR, shareholder return metrics. We can decompose that to minute levels of detail. We can understand the return on capital in different customers that we're deploying. But what are the metrics, and how do we analyze the true inner health of companies? So this is what got us started, and we spent a lot of time with those successful 200-300 companies from around the world that were sustained value creators. And this is kind of what we finally ended up with. There are 3 metrics and 3 factors that really drive the inner health of an organization. And we call this the founder's mentality. The first one really is insurgency. So what I mean by insurgency is having a really bold mission and having long horizons and creating spikiness capabilities. The example really is, how do you create the energy, what Bezos describes as always staying as day zero? That's the energy where there is a clear purpose and a clear mission that the entire organization is aligned behind. A wonderful example is really if you look at Nike, and if you go back to when they were founded, Bill Bill Ballerman was really using his waffle irons to make shoes. But the purpose of Nike is incredibly clear. High performance shoes for the sweaty athlete endorsed by an icon. That's the purpose. They wanted to shatter the industry norms and the industry operating models, but a very, very clear sense of purpose. It was very interesting. We went and spent some time with Phil Knight. And when we asked Phil Knight and we were just discussing strategy, what really struck us was the clarity in terms of what really mattered for Nike. They were not spiking on 15 different dimensions of core capabilities. Very clear, their purpose was very clear. And they said, we have 3 or 4 capabilities that we want to be truly world-class. That is what will allow us to win. For them, it was R&D on shoes, creating the best shoes available as the purpose is for the sweaty athlete. The brand and the marketing, the swoosh absolutely mattered. They needed to be endorsed by an icon, hence the Michael Jordans of the world. And they needed a great supply chain because a lot of the manufacturing was being done in Asia and other parts of the world. Very clear, 4 capabilities. But there's where they wanted to spike. Incredibly clear purpose and a mission statement, and incredibly clear spikiness of capabilities. It's interesting when you look at Ritesh talking about the young people in the audience. His mission started off as being budget aggregator in India. He's already changed his business definition quite dramatically and saying, well, is it a lodging destination, and is it multi-country, is it multi-regional? There's a huge sense of purpose in terms of how you're disrupting your industry. So the first one really is creating insurgency and a true sense of purpose that drives the people in the organization. The second one really is all about the customer, is do we have frontline obsession, and are we customer obsessed? It's interesting when we go back to MIT, one of their big pieces of research said 94% of all innovation started really at the front end and by frontline employees. And there are great examples here, whether we look at some of the Indian players, like the Oberois, who are obsessed on customer intimacy, customer advocacy. They do not want satisfied customers. They want passionate advocates, right? And then if you look at Starbucks, their entire, they lost the plot in the middle, and we know how successful Starbucks has been. But their entire revival was when Schultz came back to Starbucks. And he figured out, they had lost touch with their franchise players, which is their store managers and the baristas, and their customers. They didn't understand the customers at all. They had these big coffee machines, they had changed the menu. It was no longer the customer coffee experience that made them successful. And what Schultz does then is saying, I'm going to just re-empower and empower the baristas and the store managers. He shuts down Starbucks for a full day, provides stock options and aligned incentive to those frontline workers. Massive, massive revival in Starbucks, just driven by frontline obsession. And the third one really is owner's mindset. And this is really, how do you think like an owner and not like a standard employee? There is a wonderful example of owners thinking are always biased towards action. They are moving and they're taking action and they're decisive. Owners are always thinking about cash flow. Their deployment of capital and efficiency on capital is critical. And third is there is an aversion to bureaucracy. They want to cut through the bullshit, cut through the red tape to make things happen. If you look at AB, if you look at 3G Capital, I think most people know 3G Capital. They're one of the most successful private equity firms. We worked with them very, very closely for almost a couple of decades. And if you look at what they're doing industry after industry, they were behind the Kraft Heinz, the Burger King. But their strategy is really about, if you think about what they've done at AB on the beer side with AB InBev, and then more recently with Saab, their mindset that they're creating with their employees is what they describe of creating a culture of restaurant owners and not waiters. And it's a very interesting analog. So they have immense training to create the right values and lead to the right behaviors of their employee base. So what does this analogy mean? And what they describe is, if you are a restaurant owner and a competitor sets up shop across from you, a waiter views that as, oh, that's great. I have another option to go out and find a job. I have greater options. It looks great. A restaurant owner takes that as an assault on his or her livelihood. There's a very different mentality of how you approach competition. Second, if you look at 3G and AB InBev and what they've done in terms of their relentless focus on operating efficiency, they have moved up margins which are unprecedented in the beer industry. Today, if you look at AB InBev, post the Saab Miller, they'll be earning profit returns of about 40%. Dramatic, so you're talking about 10, 12, 14 points beyond the next competitor. So this is really about focusing on the bottom line, but just creating a mindset of an owner. So we believe these are the three factors that one could use to really understand the inner health of a company. We call this the founder's mentality. And the reason why we are obsessed now about how do you create companies that have the founder's mentality is, when you look at the data, it's incredibly stark. Founder-led companies outperform the index 3:1. And the pushback is, you've got some outliers, you take Apple, etc. I mean, they're just skewing the data. Even if you take them out, there is a dramatic overperformance of founder-led companies relative to others. So that's what led us to research why and how do we make sure we get back the founder's mentality and use that as a core area to help us grow. So this is, I couldn't not show you a 2x2. So bear with me. So it's pretty simple. On the x-axis is really the net benefits, the benefits of the founder's mentality. These are the three factors I talked about. So those on the right-hand side really is where you have a really high net benefit to founder's mentality, those three factors. On the vertical axis, everyone is looking to scale over time. You start off small, but you want to grow and you want to scale. The issue really is when you're starting from the lower quadrant on the right, you'll always start there because you've got the benefits of founder's mentality. The problem becomes with scale, your founder's mentality attributes start to get diluted and you end up on the top left quadrant. Your purpose gets a little dulled. I've got complexity in the organization, which avoids some of the frontline obsession that we talked about. And I'm becoming a little bit more bureaucratic and much more process-centric. The point on the left, on the top left, being an incumbent is an unsustainable place. And most people who are there, who've lost their secret sauce, are going to come back and get to the bottom, which is a struggling bureaucracy. So a lot of our work is really how do you make sure we stay and we come up to the top right, which is what we call a scale insurgent. And the big paradox of growth for us, if you really boil down, why people drift from the bottom right to the top left is because of the paradox of growth, which is growth creates a lot of complexity, and complexity is a silent driver of growth. So how do we scale without creating that level of complexity? We've got a bunch of data. I'm not sure whether to take you guys through it or not, but there's a full IP behind the founder's mentality. But there's a bunch of interesting factors that pushes on, which we call the Westward Winds. What pushes you, what creates that drift to the upper left quadrant? And there are things like the founder who may be great for chapter 1 is no longer the right founder for chapter 2. The founder should not be making all the calls as they have been doing in the past, or the founder who knew one particular geography may not be the right founder who knows the secret to success of how do you win in a different geography. So the founder could be one issue, hence we talk about the founder's mentality as opposed to the founder. Lost voices from the front line. When we create a huge amount of, as we scale the organization, it's interesting when we talk about the average consumer. That's really crap. I mean, our focus is really about delighting the most valuable customer, as opposed to organizations that are saying, let me make sure we have satisfied, and we look at average customers. There is a huge erosion of accountability, as well as we think about what happens when companies start to scale. And then there are also southern winds, where we say you're putting a lot of pressure as you've already become a big scale. The big one is really the curse of the matrix. Matrices are unavoidable. We want people to be fighting for customers and saying this is the tailored solution that allows us to win with the key customers. At the same point, we want those to be fighting, saying we need to think about the benefits of size and how do we make sure we get the benefits of the economies of scale. So from production and supply chain, et cetera. The challenge really is not about the matrix, it's about how do we make sure that we are raising the conflicts and we are making sure we are addressing the conflicts in a speedy manner. That is what we are not seeing in most of the organizations. So anyway, there are lots of wins. I won't go into this in too much of detail. There are the reasons why we go from the bottom right to the top left-hand part of the quadrant. So the goal and that we've all focused on in our work here is how do we create scale insurgency? That's really and we talk about for insurgent companies, it's the journey north from where we are. And it's for struggling bureaucrats and the incumbents, how do we think about going back to the top right-hand part of the quadrant? And there's been a tremendous amount of learning that we've had as we think about the reinventions of a Starbucks or a Schwab or a bunch of companies that we work with in India. So it's interesting to look at, here are some companies we would all admire, we all would relate to, and everyone is looking at, in this dynamic world, how do we think about reinvigorating the internal health to become a scale insurgent? That really is the point here. Let me show you some more data of why we believe a scale insurgent really will win in the longer term. How many of you know the Net Promoter Score, NPS? That's great. So NPS was created by Bain. So again, I'll do some marketing there. But it's on a serious note, the NPS is a lead indicator of market share. And if you look at NPS on the top right versus the bottom left, there is a dramatic difference of employees being engaged when you're a scale insurgent relative to a struggling bureaucracy. And guess what? In a market which is massively talent constrained, you want to keep the best and energize the best. This is what Ryan and I were just chatting about, the same issues with WeWork, same with us. It is the single biggest challenge that we're facing today of how we grow, is getting the best, giving them the best, giving the best opportunities to them, and getting them to stay. Having an advocacy delta of what you're seeing on this page is a source of huge competitive advantage. But it's not only that. If you look at profitability, 3 to 4x, adaptability, meritocracy, talent appeal and retention, etc., there is a huge source of competitive advantage sitting in getting the inner health and focusing on the founder's mentality. So let me just end with a couple of thoughts in terms of how do we think about and what are the high-level perspectives of how do you become a scale insurgent. So I would talk about 3 things that really to us are critical. First is the first 2 points together is how do you create a microcosm of a company that you want to be, which again empowers the front line and is all focused on innovation, experimentation, and the speed that is critical for us. And we've developed a whole IP around this concept called micro battles, which is launching micro battles at the front end of the distribution and giving the front line the power to drive, the power to experiment, and the power to fail fast. But once it starts to work in any one part of the business, how do you then bring it back in? And then how do you use that to dramatically scale in the entire organization? So there's a whole body of literature in terms of changing large legacy companies to creating a microcosm using micro battles or being much more agile in terms of how you organize. The second one really is how do you invest in critical new capabilities when the market is dramatically changing. So if you look at just some of the tech companies here, just bear with me for a second. We studied these 6, and if you look at Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Ali, Cisco, in the last 3 years, they've made 144 acquisitions. 144 acquisitions. On average, roughly about 25 acquisitions each. And what is interesting is many of them are focused on their core business. How do we strengthen capabilities and make sure we are getting what is the best from the outside and doing the right job integrating it? But how do we also think about non-core businesses and thinking ahead about new areas of growth to stay ahead of the curve? So clearly the second big imperative is how do I access the right capabilities for enabling growth? And the third one I would say really is how do we think about Engine 2? So let me describe what I mean by Engine 2. This is something that we are doing at Payne as well. Engine 1 is your core business. Your core has to be rock solid. And there is always huge opportunity of how do you think about driving full potential of your core. So I won't bore you through that, but there's a whole literature on how do you maximize and get to full potential of your core. The second part is you've got to think about adjacency expansion. Every successful firm taps adjacencies. The challenge with adjacencies, it has a 75% failure rate. So there is, how do you get adjacencies right is absolutely critical. But given all the change we talked about in the beginning, how do we think about reinventing the business? And that's what we call by Engine 2. So if you think about Google today, Google has an allocation, a resource allocation of 70-20-10. 70% core, 20% on adjacencies, and 10% of resources are going on to think about those moonshot big bets that might completely destroy the core or reinvent the core, which is what we're calling Engine 2. And I'll just give you 3 examples to make this come to life, which is really, if you think about over a long period of time, the way IBM has pivoted their business from the traditional hardware to today a software-driven, cloud-driven, consulting-oriented business. I think we all use Netflix, but it's amazing. This is the 3rd or the 4th pivot for Netflix, from starting with DVDs to streaming, to now owning and creating their own content. That's what I mean by Engine 2. And same with Marvel as well. So those were the 3 things that I wanted to leave you with. How do I use micro battles to re-energize the organization and give power back to the front end and cut through the bureaucracy? How do we think about acquiring the right capabilities that are critical for my core and non-core business? And then how do I think about investments in Engine 2, which is critical for me to win in the long term? Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Singh. I think we've learned a lot about founders' mentality and the importance of passion. The cohort here has a few questions. The first one is by Abhijit Ganesh. Do we have a mic?
I can hear you. Why don't you just ask? It's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Because we are working with a whole host of startups as I mentioned, in India, Southeast Asia, even the big ones globally. It's a great place to start because they're at the top, they're at the bottom right. And they're trying to make sure they don't drift over like legacy companies and get to the left-hand side. So what we're working with them, we're working with the largest internet companies in India today and we've been behind some of the biggest acquisitions. It's really about making sure that I'm following through on all three parts of the founder's mentality that we talked about. Huge opportunities as we think about helping them scale. So scalability is probably one of the single biggest challenges they face today. How do they think about their operating model when I'm changing in such a drastic speed? So we are helping them a lot on the organization side, a lot on the operating model side. How do I structure it? So there's huge value added there. Second is they are all pretty well funded, as I'm sure you're very well aware. So how do I think about the big bets that I'm going to make? In India, we're talking about how do we open up the next 2, 3, 400 million consumers. By 2030, if you look at the data, it's quite scary. We're doing this big piece for the World Economic Forum. We'll present it in Davos next year. By 2030, we'll say there's 70 million middle class of households. There'll be 1 billion people that will be either Gen Z or millennials. There'll be 600 million new internet users. Just think about it. All these internet companies are saying, how do I engage? How do I access? What is my value proposition to reach out to this group? It's all about making sure I'm being obsessed with the customer, and the customer is dramatically changing. So I think there is a tremendous amount that we can help them on, and also thinking about some of the systems and processes where you can scale, but you're not killing and creating undue bureaucracy, which is what, there's been lots and lots of mistakes how people have made. So it's a great place to work because these are the kind of companies that are really scaling at the 3 to 5x in a year. And it's a huge place for us to add value and also learn, by the way. I'll take one more question if you don't mind. I have a flight that I
The next question is by Anshuman Bhandari.
Good afternoon, sir. My question is that what do you see as the most disruptive innovations in the healthcare sector by new startups or by companies who are acquiring non-core companies which are doing some disruptive work in healthcare? And how are consulting firms enabling them to create impact on a larger scale in, say, the Indian context?
If you think about India, the role of technology can be mind-boggling when it comes, and it's hugely essential when it comes to healthcare. What's our biggest challenge today? Our biggest challenge is access. Our provision today is focused on top 20 cities, right? We have a huge unorganized sector, which is the nursing homes, the large hospitals. So how do I access this huge population? And unfortunately, that population is really sick. The prevalence of non-communicable diseases is a disaster that's waiting to happen. We talk about the demographic dividend, but if you look at the health of Indians, we don't know how sick we are. So what we would love to do is, use technology to provide early intervention. That is disruptive. I don't want to be treating people when they get into secondary and tertiary care, which is 20 times as expensive as when I can treat them with generic drugs, which is where the capital, which is what India is known for, or even think about prevention. So technology can help me screen and figure out who's at risk. Technology can help me engage with those that have chronic diseases and get access to basic healthcare when people in the tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 towns don't have it because the docs, we have a massive shortage of medical personnel. But for basic care, we don't need to be in the hinterlands. We can use technology to provide that access, and that's where we can make a massive, meaningful difference to the lives of Indians. So the opportunity here is huge. It'll be great to watch kind of what happens with Ayushman Bharat. I think they're focused a lot on the secondary, tertiary care. But to me, the biggest area of intervention is early intervention, primary care, and using technology to enable that. So guys, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Karan Singh.